As of January 2018, this regular podcast is available on our Andy Yeh Alpha fintech network platform. President Donald Trump delivers his first State of the Union address. Several key highlights touch on socio-economic issues from fiscal stimulus and trade protectionism to infrastructure, immigration, and national security. The massive Trump tax cuts provide tremendous relief for the middle-class Americans and small businesses. About 3 million American workers receive tax incentives primarily due to this legislative win for the Trump administration and Republican-driven Congress. When the U.S. Trade Act Section 301 investigation concludes in due course, the Trump administration expects to escalate tariffs, quotas, and even embargoes on Chinese imports. These tariffs and other trade barriers effectively penalize China for perennial patent, trademark, and copyright infringement and other intellectual property theft. This trade protectionism helps eradicate hefty U.S. trade deficits to the detriment of China and some Western allies such as Canada, Europe, and Mexico. Trump also urges Congress to pass new legislation in order to replenish $1.5 billion U.S. modern infrastructure with new roads, bridges, highways, railways, and waterways. Moreover, the Trump administration designs new immigration policies with better border control to circumvent drugs, gangs, and other criminal activities that plague many U.S. immigrant communities. Finally, Trump introduces foreign investment restrictions in defense of national economic security from LTE broadband technology to 5G telecommunication. All of these economic reforms can help ensure sustainable economic prosperity in America. After its flagship iPhone X launch, Apple reports its highest quarterly sales revenue over $80 billion in the tech titan's 41-year history. Apple expects to distribute to its shareholders $143 billion cash stockpiles in the form of cash dividends and share repurchases. Apple also plans to make $30 billion capital investments in America in the next 5 years. Most of these capital expenditures contribute to opening data centers for iCloud services. Apple expects to create more than 20,000 new jobs at its extant campuses and a new one for technical support. In fact, Apple is the latest one to announce new cash distributions that arise from the new Trump tax holiday. For the Trump administration and Republican-driven Congress, this legislative victory aims to transform corporate tax credits into better jobs and higher wages. Some companies may instead funnel these tax credits into share buyback and dividend payout in order to sidestep American workers. It is thus important for most investors to assess whether these tax cuts can serve as key fiscal stimulus for better domestic employment and macroeconomic growth. In due course, the Trump stock market rally can continue in the medium term only when 3% to 3.5% real GDP growth trickles down to benefit the typical U.S. consumer, producer, and financial intermediary. Amazon, Berkshire Hathaway, and J.P. Morgan Chase form a new company to reduce U.S. employee healthcare costs in direct negotiations with drug makers, doctors, and hospitals. Jeff Bezos, Warren Buffett, and Jamie Dimon effectively take on the world's most expensive healthcare network. This new non-profit venture poses a new challenge to an inefficient U.S. healthcare system. Also, this joint venture causes the share prices of healthcare companies to decline across the board. The new company will initially focus on innovative technology for high-quality and transparent healthcare for more than 500,000 U.S. employees across Amazon, Berkshire, and J.P. Morgan. The tripartite entity can negotiate directly with drug makers, doctors, and hospitals in order to use their vast databases to handle higher healthcare service costs. In turn, these negotiations undercut the healthcare industry's middlemen from health insurers to pharmacies such as CVS, Aetna, Cigna, Merck, J&J, and Novartis. U.S. healthcare expenditures increase faster than inflation from year to year. As of early 2018, these healthcare expenditures account for 18% of total real GDP. U.S. corporations sponsor healthcare benefits and services for more than 160 million American workers. Overall, the new tripartite joint venture represents a major healthcare innovation that can shake up the inefficient U.S. healthcare industry. As he refrains from using the memorable phrase irrational exuberance to describe bullish investor sentiments, Alan Greenspan discerns asset bubbles in the U.S. stock and bond markets in early 2018. Despite some recent healthy fundamental recalibration, Greenspan warned of high U.S. stock indices from Dow and S&P 500 to Nasdaq and Fortune 500. Also, Greenspan points out that the current government bond yields hover not far from historically low thresholds. The latter may transform into potential yield curve inversion, which often signals the early dawn of an economic recession. In fact, this inversion correctly predicts U.S. economic downturns in all decades right after the 1960s. As the Federal Reserve gradually normalizes and tightens its monetary policy stance, interest rates continue to raise the relative likelihood of yield curve inversion. Greenspan shares his ingenious insight that higher long-term government bond yields may determine the extent and duration of bullish investor sentiments during the current interest rate hike. Whether the Trump administration can address the fiscal gap with $2+ trillion government expenditures and $1.5 trillion tax cuts critically depends on the future U.S. real GDP growth trajectory. The Trump administration expects 3% to 3.5% U.S. real GDP economic growth for this self-finance to trickle down to the typical American. On balance, Greenspan's prescient comments warn of the current fiscal shortfall that may fuel U.S. debt escalation as a proportion of total real GDP. Most major economies grow with great synchronicity several years after the global financial crisis. These economies experience high stock market valuation, healthy fundamental recalibration, job creation, greater productivity, and artificial intelligence automation. For instance, the U.S. economy operates near full employment with 1.5% to 2% moderate inflation, $2.45 trillion mandatory government expenditures, and $1.5 trillion tax cuts. Also, Europe finally feels the banana effects of easy money that arises from the European Central Bank's quantitative easing and negative interest rate monetary policies. Asian tiger economies such as Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan experience economic revival due to the upstream prosperity of Apple and Samsung-driven mobile device production. Recent oil price increases boost economic gains for Russia, Saudi Arabia, and other Middle East producers. Brazil still suffers the ripple effects of a veritable depression and now flashes tentative signs of economic recovery with high population dividends. However, several other economies exhibit weak macro momentum with chaotic bouts of economic policy uncertainty. England now has to confront high unstable exchange rates, wide stock market gyrations, and trade barriers in the post-Brexit investment horizon. China may land hard with sub-6% real GDP economic growth due to the potential Sino-American trade war. Mexico may fail to transcend fears and doubts that the Trump administration menaces its recent economic convalescence with hefty tariffs and border taxes. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, now predicts 2.7% to 3% U.S. real GDP growth and 3.7% to 3.9% economic growth worldwide. IMF research warns of economic inequality, cybersecurity, extreme weather, as well as political confrontations such as U.S.-Korean nuclear threats and fair trade barriers. European Union antitrust regulators have imposed a fine on Qualcomm for advancing its exclusive microchip deal with Apple to block out rivals such as Intel and TSMC. The European Commission takes into account Qualcomm's multi-year dominance in the LTE microchip market with rapid mobile broadband connections. In recent times, Qualcomm attempts to force Apple and its upstream suppliers to use its trademark microchips exclusively in return for lower licensing fees. Qualcomm can thus unfairly cut out intense competition in the LTE chipset market. In fact, Qualcomm pays billions of US dollars to Apple so that it would not buy from other microchip producers. These payments represent not just price reductions, but the primary condition that Apple would exclusively use Qualcomm's baseband chipsets in all its iPhones and iPads. Several other smartphone rivals such as Lenovo, Oppo, Vivo, and Xiaomi express an active interest in buying $2 billion Qualcomm chipsets over 3 years. No microchip rivals would be able to effectively challenge Qualcomm in this market regardless of product quality improvements. As a result, the European Commission has to penalize Qualcomm for its anti-competitive market behavior. This EU regulatory decision has deep economic implications for Apple and other mobile device suppliers and manufacturers worldwide. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin welcomes a weaker greenback amid pervasive fears of an open trade war between America and China. At the World Economic Forum, Mnuchin praises the recent steady greenback devaluation that helps promote competitive U.S. export prices. This praise adds noise to the status quo as Trump intends to withdraw from the North American Free Trade Agreement, the Paris Climate Change Accord, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Canadian, French, and Indian prime ministers accused the Trump administration of unfair protectionism that trade deficits beget tariffs, quotas, and even embargoes. Trumpism prevails in the face of international reprehension when the weaker dollar reaches a 3-year trough and gold prices rise to the highest level in about 2 years. Throughout the Reagan, Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations, we can associate each sharp U.S. dollar depreciation with fiscal stimulus, export expansion, and subsequent interest rate hike. In order to resolve the twin deficit problem, that is both fiscal deficit and trade deficit, the Federal Reserve needs to raise the interest rate further to attract capital flows from abroad. It is also important for the Trump administration to attract foreign investors to buy Treasury bonds to finance the perennial U.S. fiscal debt and deficit. Exchange rate stabilization remains a hot pursuit for U.S. policymakers to serve in the best interests of American workers and investors. The Economist digs deep into the political economy of U.S. government shutdown over 3 days in January 2018. In more than 4 years since 2014, America's first government shutdown looks likely to end soon. Government shutdowns cost a great deal, dampen stock market investor sentiments and expectations, and embarrass congressional members on both the Senate and House of Representatives. Democrats now exacerbate procedural uncertainty and so put pressure on the Republican Senate Majority Leader over DACA and Obamacare legislative issues. Both DACA and Obamacare are controversial milestones, and Democrats require reasonable solutions to carefully crafting better health care and immigration bills. President Trump urges Congress to pass a bill of love for DACA recipients to stay with legal residency, but not citizenship, in exchange for border security finance and stronger enforcement of immigration laws. Also, both Republicans and Democrats seek to present their alternative cases for health care reforms in lieu of Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act. These legislative issues matter much because an increase in U.S. government debt and deficit may trigger greater seigniorage in light of constant money supply growth and Treasury bond issuance. The result in seigniorage discrepancy then translates into inflation that manifests in higher general prices for the typical American consumer. In accordance with its dual mandate, the Federal Reserve would need to accelerate the current neutral interest rate hike to contain inflation near full employment. These ripple effects may dampen stock and bond prices, investor sentiments, and macroeconomic expectations. The Economist delves into the modern perils of tech titans such as Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and Google. These tech titans often receive plaudits for making the world a better place. However, some pundits accuse these tech giants of being bad or big, addictive, anti-competitive, and destructive to democracy. Politicians from European Union and to U.S. Congress grill their CEOs, regulators impose taxes and fines on these tech titans, and one-time backers warn of their power to cause harm. Techlash complaints, privacy concerns, and fake news are rampant these days. Big tech platforms, particularly Amazon, Facebook, and Google, raise deep concerns about fair competition and consumer protection because these platforms often benefit from legal exemptions. Unlike publishers and media firms, Facebook and Google rake in hefty ad profits with minimum monitor and responsibility for content curation. For many years, American buyers on Amazon need not pay sales taxes. Also, Apple has kept its net profits as large offshore cash stockpiles in order to legitimately avoid paying U.S. corporate income taxes. These platform orchestrators provide digital infrastructure for online ad revenue, consumer data, and service provision. Most of their services appear to be free, but consumers need to pay for these services by giving away their personal data. Their high stock valuation reinforces digital dominance and market concentration. For instance, Amazon accounts for about half of U.S. online sales while Facebook and Google attract nearly 70% of online advertisements in America. It is highly likely for regulatory agencies to tame these tech titans by probing into potential privacy invasion and tax avoidance. Either these tech giants break up into smaller entities, as Alphabet now prepares for Google and other subsidiaries, or these giants pay in the form of taxes, fines, or compliance costs. President Trump considers imposing retaliatory economic sanctions on Chinese goods and services in response to China's theft and infringement of U.S. intellectual property. Trump's retaliatory trade sanctions may involve tariffs, quotas, embargoes, and other restrictions on China's investments in U.S. entities. This punitive penalty arises as part of a recent Trade Act Section 301 probe into China's recent regulations that induce U.S. multinational corporations to establish onshore IT data centers. These regulations force unfair intellectual property theft and technology transfer from these U.S. multinational corporations to their Chinese counterparts. Without such technology transfer, the use and implementation of U.S. patents and trademarks would otherwise involve egregious infringement at the expense of U.S. firms and other innovators. Recent empirical evidence suggests that this unfair technology transfer may be the root cause of both billions of dollar losses in corporate revenue as well as millions of job losses in America. In addition to intellectual property theft and infringement, the Trump administration further accuses China of currency manipulation. Over the years, China has been accumulating substantial dollar reserves in the form of U.S. Treasury bonds for better renminbi devaluation. This deliberate devaluation leads to more competitive Chinese export prices and thus better low-cost product sales abroad. The Trump administration thus needs to consider retaliatory trade sanctions on China in order to eradicate trade deficits with better fiscal discipline. BlackRock CEO Larry Fink emphasizes his conviction that public corporations must make a positive contribution to society apart from boosting the bottom line. Society now demands that each public or private company serves a social purpose. To prosper over time, each company must not only deliver financial performance, but each company must also demonstrate how it makes a positive contribution to society. This kind reminder is a major watershed moment on Wall Street and raises questions about the unique nature of capitalism. The Fink letter serves as a lightning rod of stakeholder value maximization for institutional investors such as BlackRock, Vanguard, Charles Schwab, Fidelity, Franklin Templeton, Allianz, State Street, PIMCO, and GM. Key stakeholders include not only shareholders but also employees, customers, suppliers, regulators, and intellectual property protectors. The government may fail to prepare for the future generations on socio-economic issues such as retirement, infrastructure, automation, and education. As a result, society has to increasingly rely on the private sector in order to better respond to broader societal challenges. If a company cannot engage with the community with a crystal-clear sense of social purpose, this company may ultimately lose the license to operate for better stakeholder value. For instance, some institutional investors and activist shareholders require Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon to consider the detrimental effects of mobile devices on children. Mutual funds and insurance companies, for example Berkshire Hathaway, monitor whether energy companies such as ExxonMobil, BP, Phillips 66, and Saudi Aramco help mitigate environmental degradation. Also, many billionaires joined the Giving Pledge campaign to curb global economic inequality. The Gates Foundation continues to help eradicate preventable diseases due to malaria, polio, guinea worm, and smallpox in Africa and the Middle East. Nowadays, each company thus has to serve a social purpose in order to attract capital flows from asset management firms. Spotify considers directly selling its shares to the retail public with no underwriter involvement. The music streaming company plans a direct list on NYSE in lieu of a hot IPO. This alternative procedure can be cheaper, faster, and less legally risky to the issuer. The issuer may lose its first-day price run-up in a hot IPO, which seldom benefits anyone apart from the institutional investors who receive an initial allocation of shares. In contrast, most startups file for an IPO through investment banks. These underwriters round up institutional investors to buy the issuer's fresh shares in order to establish a fair market price. Through a promotional roadshow, the underwriters commit to covering these new shares in their due diligence and fair valuation. The underwriters receive a considerable bounty in the order of 3% to 5% of the IPO price, for example $300 million fee payment to Alibaba's underwriters. As cash-rich companies such as Spotify, Uber, and Airbnb have little incentive to raise capital via IPOs, these cash cows may prefer to directly list on stock exchanges. Spotify can thus bypass firm commitment on the part of IPO fee-driven investment banks. However, the direct list may expose Spotify to bear raid by short sellers, little underwriter liability, and less blue-sky transparency. This direct list option may attract more unicorns into the U.S. public stock market. Zuckerberg announces major changes in Facebook's newsfeed algorithm and user authentication. Facebook now has to change the newsfeed filter in order to prioritize what family and friends share. At the same time, Facebook reduces the amount of non-advertising content from brands and publishers. This transition places a much greater emphasis on each user's inner circle and social network. Organic business reach and engagement would dramatically decline as a result. Also, this transition can adversely affect several key metrics such as regular impressions, unique page views, and periodic user interactions. Numerous critics blame Facebook's prior newsfeed algorithms that may inadvertently prioritize misinformation. Moreover, these critics point out that Facebook might have been the conduit for Russian influence in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. This issue also applies to both domestic and foreign interference in major political discourse elsewhere outside America. After all, Facebook seeks to fulfill its core mission of connecting people and communities with informative and meaningful user interactions in the world. Because Facebook refrains from becoming a media firm, the tech titan continues its artificial intelligence-driven social network platform as an online distributor of online ads and news. In addition to user privacy concerns, Zuckerberg hopes to generate more revenue from individual and business accounts with better user authentication via Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. Subsequent to the Trump tax cuts for Christmas 2017, the one-year-old Trump presidency now aims to make progress on healthcare, infrastructure, social welfare, and immigration in 2018. First, President Trump plans to repeal and replace Obamacare in due course. He also seeks to reduce drug prices and other medical costs for the typical American. Second, the Trump administration proposes $1 billion infrastructure investments in several major American states and cities. This campaign promise serves the best interests of workers with less educational attainment and more labor intensity. Third, the Trump administration seeks to roll out an executive order to mandate a holistic review of federal safety net programs. These programs encompass food stamps, Medicaid incentives, and residential housing benefits etc. Fourth, President Trump keeps an ambivalent attitude toward immigration issues such as illegal immigrant deportation and foreign child deferral. All of this government intervention helps alleviate at least some social welfare concerns. From an economic perspective, it is a bit difficult to see how the Trump administration can fund these reforms without some form of fiscal discipline. In the next few years, tax cuts trump trade, whereas U.S. real GDP economic growth has to rise to 3% to 3.5% for fiscal stimulus to trickle down to the typical American consumer and business. Warren Buffett cleverly points out that American children will not only be better off than their parents, but the former will also enjoy higher living standards in the next few decades. His top two secrets to U.S. wealth creation are innovation and productivity. The former entails new technology transfer in education, healthcare, finance, communication, and so forth. The latter involves labor augmenting productivity gains that can readily turn into real GDP economic growth. As the CEO and chairman of Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett has a net worth of $85 billion as of early 2018. He is a generous philanthropist who has given away more than $27 billion in the past decade. This multi-billionaire is well known for his frugal life habits, enjoys daily McDonald's breakfasts, and insists on using his favorite flip phone. Buffett prefers to invest in blue-chip value stocks or public companies with high ratios of book-to-market equity, dividend-to-price, and net income to price. Moreover, Buffett believes that sound corporate governance contributes to both better firm valuation and operating performance with competitive moats. At Berkshire Hathaway, Buffett beats most money managers with a hefty 19% geometric average annual return. Buffett's value investment philosophy focuses on buying the common equity of public companies that operate as profitable cash cows with conservative asset growth. The world now faces an economic inequality crisis with few policy options. Some recent Federal Reserve data suggest that both income and wealth inequality accelerates in America. The top 3% own 54% of America's wealth, whereas the bottom 90% own only 24% of America's wealth. The top 3% rake in a much greater proportion of total income in comparison to the prior state back in 2010, whereas the bottom 90% earn proportionately less now. U.S. income and wealth concentrate in white residents, homeowners, and upper social echelons with better educational attainment. This economic inequality between the rich and the poor also prevails in Britain, China, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, France, Germany, and other parts of the Eurozone. Populist politics seem to have become a natural reaction to this worldwide inequality in light of Brexit, Trump presidential election victory, and strongman rule by Putin, Xi, and Duterte. Pundits and policymakers can consider several solutions such as income tax credit, greater public investment in education, more progressive wage versus capital income tax treatment, and less residential segregation. A more radical solution involves what Professor Thomas Piketty proposes as global capital taxation. The latter may affect international capital flows as Tobin taxes dampen the average after-tax rate on capital investments in different countries. President Trump targets Amazon in his call for U.S. Postal Service to charge higher delivery prices on the e-commerce giant. Trump picks another fight with an online retail giant that he has criticized during the presidential campaign. Nowadays USPS runs a large net loss and serves as an independent agency within the federal government with minimal tax dollars for operating expenses. In fact, package delivery has become an increasingly important part of USPS business because the internet has led to a sharp decline in the amount of first-class letters. USPS delivers 60% plus of Amazon packages with about 4 million parcels per day during the current peak year-end holiday shipping season. Amazon's other major carriers are UPS and FedEx that collectively account for about 30% of Amazon parcels. Both UPS and FedEx have long voiced their concerns and complaints about USPS cost structure. In fact, USPS deficit has ballooned to about $62 billion, and this situation cannot sustain in the long run. If the Trump administration induces USPS to charge much more on Amazon packages, the e-commerce giant may pass higher costs on to American consumers and small businesses. Also, worldwide shipping operations may become too expensive to the detriment of international online consumers. The current status quo remains a time-worn impasse between e-commerce and postal service. Goldman Sachs takes a $5 billion income hit that results from its offshore cash repatriation under the new Trump tax law. This income hit reflects 10% to 15% tax payments that each large bank can spread over 8 years. Also, Citigroup expects to experience a temporary $20 billion income hit due to offshore cash repatriation, while Bank of America expects a similar one-time $3 billion income hit. Several other banks such as JP Morgan Chase and Wells Fargo are likely to receive similar preferential treatment under the Trump tax holiday. This preferential tax treatment allows most financial institutions to repatriate offshore cash stockpiles to invest in domestic job creation, R&D innovation, and capital equipment usage. In effect, the Trump tax holiday empowers multinational banks to experience short-term pains in exchange for long-term gains under the new territorial tax system. This new tax law is a major legislative victory for the Trump administration, with strong support from Republicans over the joint opposition of Democrats. The recent triple effects apply not only to large multinational banks but also multinational corporations, especially tech titans such as Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon. Overall, these medium to long-term tax cuts can continue to extend the Trump stock market rally. As former chairman of the British Financial Services Authority and former director of the London School of Economics, Howard Davis shares his ingenious insights into the new Basel IV Accord. This new accord balances the U.S. and French bids for minimum bank capital output floors to arrive at the midpoint of 72.5% equity capital output under the old Basel standard approach. In fact, this harmonization helps reduce large heterogeneity in internal capital requirements under the prior Basel III regime. Although the use and introduction of internal risk models can facilitate risk-sensitive and meaningful capital calibrations, wide capital output dispersion may be suboptimal. This wide dispersion suggests that the capital results may differ dramatically when the bank applies different internal risk models to calibrate to the same loan portfolios. Also, some proponents point out that most recent improvements in bank capital ratios result from lower credit asset growth, rather than higher net equity issuance. Should most banks raise equity to strengthen their core capital ratios toward the healthy range of 10% to 15% or even 20%, these banks may experience high costs of capital with less available loan credit. These ripple effects can adversely affect real macro variables such as real GDP, economic growth, employment, and capital equipment usage. Thus, it is important for international bank regulators to standardize minimum capital requirements to assuage these concerns. In addition to this major Basel IV regime change, the U.S. Federal Reserve Vice Chairman Randall Quarles proposes simplifying the Volcker rule that prevents banks from using their own money to place market bets on stocks, bonds, indices, funds, currencies, commodities, and derivatives. In recent years, many eminent economists point out that the Volcker rule cannot be one of the culprits of the global financial crisis from 2008 to 2009. This rule may be too restrictive for most global systemically important banks. As part and parcel of this new influx of new bank rules, it is important for banks to carefully craft their living wills for better open bank resolution during a major financial crisis. This resolution may involve outright liquidation, bank recapitalization, or bridge bank sale. Overall, these new regulations can be conducive to promoting sound and efficient bank capital arrangements in most home host jurisdictions.